Okay, here we go. We just finished, let's just kind of reiterate, we just finished the election of 1860, so let's kind of go through that because that's a big part of your test tomorrow. Remember that the Democrats split in the election of 1860. The Southern Democrats, who supported slavery, nominated one individual, and the Northern Democrats, who pushed more towards popular sovereignty to solve the issue of slavery, did another candidate. Who did the Southern Democrats nominate for president? Chantel?
John C. Breckinridge.
And what was he doing at the time of his nomination? What was his job?
He was the vice president.
He was the vice president, right. How about the Northern Democrats, Kyle? Who did they nominate?
Stephen Douglas.
Stephen Douglas, very good. And we mentioned to you that any time a political party splits and nominates two people, it makes it difficult for them to win. Okay? The Republican Party met and they had two candidates. Milo, give me one of those candidates the Republicans thought about. Abe Lincoln. And Will, who was the other one?
William Seward.
And what was his job at the time?
I
What was he doing with his life?
don't remember.
You don't remember? I bet Nia does.
No, I don't.
You don't? Talent?
Governor of New York.
He was governor of New York. That'd be good to know. Okay, now remember, we said that during the choosing of the nominee, the delegates had a very difficult time choosing a candidate. We talked about how the first ballot worked and the second ballot worked, and we compared it to the election of 1960 when Kennedy won on the first ballot on the last state possible, which was Wyoming. Well, in this particular election, it took 4 different ballots to get a nominee. On the first ballot, who won, Mason?
Seward.
But what was his problem, Kylie?
He didn't have two majority.
Very good. Second ballot, what happened, Keller?
Yeah, pretty much even.
So nobody won the second ballot, right? Okay, how about the third ballot, Buck? Who won?
Lincoln
Well-
was two.
Oh, go ahead.
Lincoln was 2 delegates short.
But he had one, but he had two, he was 2 delegates short of nomination. And on the fourth ballot, he finally rallied and received the necessary delegate votes. Now we had a third political party in Bailey. What was the name of that party that came in?
The Constitutional Union Party.
That's right, and who was their nominee? Gracie? Macy Gracie?
Bell.
And what was his job at the time?
He was governor of Tennessee.
Not the governor.
Senator.
He was a senator from Tennessee. Now, what was the strategy in the elections here? Who did it look like would win this election? The candidate that did what?
On the north.
Okay, won the North. All right. So when it all comes to being, how many states did Bell win, Meg?
Lee.
Okay, Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. How did Breckinridge do there, Madison?
He carried all the southern states.
Other than Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, right? He carried the remainder of the southern states. How many states did Douglas carry, Blaine?
2.
Just 2, Missouri and New Jersey, which meant that the person that's going to carry most of the North, which was most important, was Abraham Lincoln, and thus he becomes the nation's 16th president. Now that takes us a drifting towards war, because just in essence, what's Lincoln going to not be in, double negative, what is he not in favor of? Slavery. He's going to try to get rid of slavery, or at least put it in its place, which is going to alienate the southern states right away, and they know it. As soon as he's elected, they think they're going to go to conflict, because they know that he's going to try to get rid of the thing that makes their livelihood, right? So it's a problem right off the bat. So with Lincoln's victory in the election of 1860, we're having a serious problem here. So on December 20th of 1860, not long after the election, anybody want to guess which state was the first state to secede from the Union? South Carolina, very good. So on December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina secedes from the Union. And by February 1st of the next year of 1861, all the states in what was considered the Deep South followed suit. So, as I mentioned, and Talon answered, on December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, and by February 1st of 1861, all of the states in the region we know as the Deep South followed suit, which would include the following states: Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. So on December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union. By February 1st, 1861, all the states in the Deep South followed suit, which included Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. On February 8th, just a week later, a temporary government was established at Montgomery, Alabama. A temporary government was established at Montgomery, Alabama. And what was the name of this new government? Anybody know? Confederate States of America. So on February 8th, 1861, a temporary government was established at Montgomery, Alabama. The name of this new government was the Confederate States of America. As soon as they established themselves, they took 3 important steps. As soon as the Confederate States of America established itself on February 8, 1861, they took the following 3 steps. What's the first thing they did? New government, what do you need?
Constitution.
Before that?
A leader.
Yeah, a leader, a president. And they chose who? Jefferson Davis. So the first thing they did is they chose a president of this new Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. What do you think you'd do next? John Brown tried to do it for the North, but he didn't get her done. What? Well, what was he doing? What's that? Not yet. Before that, what did he do? Seize. They seized all federal arsenals and all federal property in the South. Who owned it at the time? The Union. But the South, the Confederate States of America, as soon as they established themselves, they seized all of the federal arsenals and all property that belonged to the federal government that was in the South, they took. So they seized all federal arsenals in the South and all government property. Now, what do you think they did? This is kind of interesting. What did they do after that to enlist some help to defeat the North in an upcoming civil war they received? What did they do to enlist some help?
Hire mercenaries.
Maybe. You're not far, you're off, but you're on the right track. What did they do? No?
Slaves fought.
They sent Southern diplomats to both England and France to try to negotiate both financial and military assistance. They sent Southern diplomats to both England and France to try to negotiate either or financial assistance or military assistance. So they were looking for Europe to help them defeat the North. So they sent Southern diplomats to England and France to try to negotiate both financial and military assistance. Now, there were 4 southern states that chose at this time not to leave the Union. But they said they would secede if the Union used any force against the states that did secede. Does that make sense? So you have 4 southern states who at this point choose not to secede, but make it clear that we will secede from the Union if the Union uses any force against these states that already seceded. Who were those 4 states? Anybody want to take a shot?
Texas.
What?
Texas.
No, Texas already seceded. Any? What's that? Virginia? Tennessee? Kentucky? No, he already seceded.
Kentucky did?
No, not Kentucky. North Carolina, and if you're a Razorback, you're from here. Arkansas. So the 4 southern states that did not leave the Union at the time, but stated they would leave the Union if any force was used against those states that seceded, were Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas. Now, who's the president when all this happens up to this point? Who's the president right now? Hasn't been inaugurated yet.
Nobody.
James Buchanan. Buchanan is the man that is not going to do anything about this because he's about to what? Leave office. So this will be Lincoln's problem to inherit when he takes office. Okay, so Lincoln has his inauguration day. And he's sworn into office as the 16th President of the United States. And in his inaugural address, he makes these two things perfectly clear to the American people. So Lincoln, on Inauguration Day, is sworn in as the nation's 16th United States President. And during his inaugural address, he makes these two things perfectly clear in his speech. One, secession from the Union is illegal. He makes it real clear that during his presidency, seceding from the Union will be considered illegal. And two, that any federal property in the South will be held by the federal government and protected. So you're going to see a conflict, because what has the South made arrangements to do? Seize all Southern federal arsenals and property. Lincoln saying in his inaugural address that all federal property in the South will be held by the Union or the federal government and protected. And that statement and events that happen after that statement, which is our next subtopic, are the main reason that we eventually go to civil war, and that's the fall of Fort Sumter. Fall of Fort Sumter. Now, let's think about this. What did the Confederates say is one of their things they did right away? They elected a president. They sent negotiators to to France and England to try to negotiate financial military assistance. What else did they do? Now, Lincoln said they weren't going to allow. He wasn't going to allow that, right? But what happened between the time that they formed the Confederate States of America and Lincoln taking office? What do you think happened during Buchanan's presidency? They seized them. So one thing that Lincoln made clear when he took the office of presidency, not the oath, but when he became president, is that they would not try to recover any Southern property that had already been taken during the Buchanan administration. He wasn't going to go back and try to take anything that had already been taken, but he would protect everything from this point forward. And there were really two Union military posts in the South that Lincoln was willing to protect at any cost. One was Fort Pickens in Florida, and the other one was Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So Lincoln made it clear when he went into the Oval Office, so to speak, that they wouldn't try to recover any of the federal property in the South that was taken during the latter stages of the Buchanan presidency. But they would protect everything from this point on, and the two most important military posts that he was going to protect at all costs was Fort Pickens in Florida and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And when he made that comment, he sent U.S. Navy ships to both forts with supplies to make sure that they were protected. So he sent U.S. Navy ships with supplies to both forts to make sure that they were not going to be able to be taken. So he sent U.S. Navy ships to both forts so they could protect themselves. Well, word travels fast, even faster than through the halls of Worland High School. And word reached the Confederates that they were going to be sending supplies before the supplies got there. And because the Confederates heard of this news, they immediately attacked Fort Sumter before the supplies had a chance to get there. Okay? So the word gets out that Lincoln's going to send supplies to both forts, especially Fort Sumter is the one that the Confederates wanted the worst. They wanted the one in South Carolina. And so they attacked at 4 a.m. on April 12, 1861. So because the Confederates heard of the news of sending supplies to the forts, and they were very interested in getting Fort Sumter, the Confederates attacked the fort at 4 a.m. on April 12, 1861. Now, the Union commander at Fort Sumter was Robert Anderson, Major Robert Anderson. He was the man that was in charge of the Union fort at Fort Sumter. Robert Anderson, Major Anderson. And he did his best. He held out against the Confederates for almost 36 hours. He held off. He had very little supplies. The new supplies hadn't gotten there, so he really did a very gallant effort of holding off the Confederates for about 36 hours. And finally, he just couldn't hold on anymore, so what did he do? Surrendered and marched his men out of Fort Sumter. So Union Major Robert Anderson held out against Confederate attack for about 36 hours. Finally, he could not hold on any longer, so he surrendered the fort to the south and marched his men out. Now, this is kind of interesting. They say this was the first battle, so to speak, of the Civil War. No casualties on either side. No casualties on either side. It would be the only battle in the Civil War in which there were no casualties on either side. Only time it ever happened. You're going to hear about massive casualties when we get into this. So ironically, no one on either side was killed in what was basically a cannon fight, but it would be the last battle that would result in no casualties in the Civil War. Now, Lincoln did not take the news of this very well. He acted very quickly after he heard about the surrender of Fort Sumter. He did not take it well, and he acted quickly. And what he did is he asked for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the United States Army to fight against the Confederate States of America. So after hearing of the surrender of Fort Sumter, Lincoln immediately asked for 75,000 volunteers to enlist in the United States Army to fight against the Confederate States of America. And this enlistment was to be a 90-day tour. If they enlisted, they were committed to 90 days, or about 3 months. Okay? So after hearing about the news of the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers to join the U.S. Army, and they were making a commitment of 90-day tours, 3 months. He had so many people volunteer, thousands were turned away. He had so many men volunteered to join the U.S. Army for that 90-day enlistment tour that thousands were turned away. Once Lincoln secured those troops, what did he do immediately after that? As President of the United States, what did he do? Not yet. Who's he have to ask to do that? As soon as he gets the 75,000 troops assembled, he asks Congress to formally declare war against the Confederate States of America. Congress complied with that request, and war was declared by the Union upon the South. So just remember, we talk about the Union, we're talking about the North. When we're talking about the Confederates, we're talking about the South. Okay? Well, what happened as soon as that declaration of war occurred concerning some of those southern states? What?
Oh, those four.
Those 4 states seceded from the Union. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and part of Virginia. Not all of Virginia. The western part of Virginia chose not to. So, as soon as the word of declaration of war surfaced, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and part of Virginia seceded from the Union. The western part of Virginia, people lived there, opposed secession, so they split off and did what? Formed a new state, now known as West Virginia. That's where that came from. So the western part of Virginia at this time, which opposed secession from the Union, split off and formed a new state, West Virginia, as we know it today. So how many Confederate States of America do we have now? How many? Count them up, baby. 12. We got 10 and 12.
11.
What we got? 11. Okay, now where's the capital? Montgomery, Alabama. After these other states seceded, they moved the capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, which ironically was a very short distance from the Union capital, Washington, D.C. That's going to be a strategy in the Civil War. So as soon as those 11 states committed to secede, the Confederate States of America moved the capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. With the move of that capital, what begins in United States history? The Civil War. Now, let's give you a little review on top of the review here, so you kind of get an idea. I'll tell you some things I think you should know, unless you don't want to do this. Okay, I'm not going to get into detail, but here's what I know. Well, I'm just going to tell you some things. It's not going to be very long. I would review in your mind that movie yesterday. What might I ask you in the movie? It was not a movie.
You really like
Okay. Okay, where was it based? Okay, what else might I ask you, Bailey?
What about some of the, like, blacks who were influential?
I might ask you about that. Might have a comment about Frederick Douglass. Might have a comment about Harriet Tubman. What else might I ask you about that? How much slaves went for? How much did a man go for? How much did a woman? How much did a child? Okay, that'd be good to know also. What were some consequences of runaway slaves if they got caught? Cut off their ear? Slash their Achilles? Random. Might need to know that. Hey, weird laws. What couldn't Negroes do? Couldn't name their kids after themselves? What else? Couldn't get married? Couldn't read or write. Against the